Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you all for being here. This is our first Syracuse Cornell Consortium event this semester. And today we have a set of New York and Bangladesh-based speakers who have generously agreed to help us understand the student-led political movement in Bangladesh in early July that led to the end of Sheikh Hasina's 15-year-old regime. Some of us here might know that the student protest started in July against the job quota system that reserved 30% of civil service positions for veterans, veterans of the 1971 war and their descendants. The students saw this as unfair and outdated. But while the protest was triggered by this, students were also rising against years of widespread repression under Sheikh Hasina's growing authoritarianism, her tyrannical regime. We saw thousands of students from universities all across the country, from Dhaka and Chittagong and other cities, mobilize for change. And we also saw the government's violent response that killed close to 800 students and injured 1,000 others. Amidst the heart-wrenching grief of martyred students, the youth helped us envision a radically different future for Bangladesh and for the larger subcontinent. We gather here today to understand the larger context of what happened on the ground from folks who were closely involved with the movement as scholars and activists and international experts on Bangladesh who have written extensively on the region's political, economic, and ecological histories. It gives me great pleasure to welcome all our speakers today. I'm going to briefly introduce them, but before that, just a few pointers about what the webinar is going to look like. We have structured this as a roundtable webinar. Each speaker will have roughly 6 to 7 minutes to speak, and the roundtable will be followed by a Q&A from the audience. So please feel free to send us your questions. Our first speaker is Dr. Farhana Sultana, a professor in the Department of Geography and the Environment at the Maxwell School of Syracuse University. She's also the research director for environment at the Program for the Advancement of Research on Conflict and Collaboration at Maxwell. She's an internationally recognized scholar, writer, and speaker with expertise drawn from extensive research in Bangladesh on issues of development, climate change, water governance, and human rights. Thank you, Dr. Sultana, for being here. Our next speaker will be Dr. Dina M. Siddiqi, who's a clinical professor, liberal studies in New York University, a cultural anthropologist by training. Her research, grounded in the study of Bangladesh, joins critical development studies, transnational feminist theory, and the anthropology of labor and Islam. She's currently working on a manuscript entitled Garment Nation, Muslim Women, Industrial Labor, and Transnational Capital in Bangladesh. Thank you so much for being here with us. Dr. Muhib Rahman is a postdoctoral associate at Cornell University, researching conflict, security, cooperation, and civil-military relations. His work explores the impact of international defense cooperation on domestic politics, with a focus on elite defection and armed uprisings. He holds a PhD from the University of Texas at Austin and an MA from McGill University. Thank you so much again for being part of this webinar. We have Kazi Farzana is a doctoral candidate in history at Syracuse University and really the mind behind the webinar. She looks at the formative stages of student movements in the 1960s, the 50s, and the 60s, East Pakistan, which led to the liberation struggle for Bangladesh. Thank you so much for doing what you've done. And Tasnua Hilal Bedita is a passionate climate activist and human rights advocate. She's currently in a gap year after graduating from high school, lives in Dhaka, the capital city of Bangladesh, and in her free time, she likes to paint. Thank you so much for joining us from Bangladesh. And our final speaker is Amar bin Asad, who is studying anthropology in Jagannath University and is passionate about photography. I hope we get to see some of his images today. Thank you all for being here, Dr. Sultana. You can go. Thank you.
Thank you, Mona, for the introduction, and thank you everyone who has joined us today or is watching later on. And lastly, thank you to the Cornell and Syracuse University South Asia programs and the consortium for organizing this and hosting us together today. So what I want to do is just very briefly set the context of what's happening. So after more than 15 years of autocratic dictatorship, the kind of very brutal and violent dictatorial regime of Sheikh Hasina and her party Awami League fell in Bangladesh on August 5th. And many found it surprising to witness a student-led movement spark a mass uprising and a revolution without a civil war or external intervention. What university students started as a protest for reform in the government quota system ended up becoming one of mass brutal attacks on students by the regime and their loyalists, the militarized police force, and what is called now the bloody month of July. This regime killed over 800 people and injured 33,000 people in the space of 3 weeks. This occurred amid countrywide curfew, internet blackouts, disappearances, and other massacres, including not just students, but also civilians and even children and bystanders. So as a result, what is now dubbed as the second independence of Bangladesh, what we saw is that the students galvanizing on issues around anti-discrimination, on fairness, dignity, and justice swiftly expanded where teachers, parents, artists, celebrities, and everyday people joined forces. As a result, on August 5th, barely some 3.5 weeks ago, Sheikh Hasina fled to her most loyal backers, India. The ouster of this dictatorial regime became often called Bangladesh 2.0 and a new path to building on a history of anti-colonial revolutionary politics that were central to uprisings in the past. So our Gen Z in Bangladesh stand on the shoulders of our ancestors. But what we also witnessed was that there's always chaos and in a power vacuum when a regime falls suddenly. And there were therefore politically motivated and opportunistic attacks on Awami League party members and the brutal police force. But this was misrepresented in international media as communal violence when it was not. The student movement again very quickly organized and swiftly restored law and order that night with the assistance of the wider community. They started to self-organize into groups to manage traffic, clean waste, guard minority religious institutions and government buildings, catch culprits and vandals and bring them to justice, remove and repair damage, and rebuild infrastructure, and then largely the country at large. Within 3 days of the regime's fall, at the request of the student movement and amid wider public support, Nobel laureate Dr. Muhammad Yunus was inaugurated as the chief advisor to lead the interim government on August 8th. Now Bangladesh has a fairly diverse and progressive interim government cabinet. So what the student movement did was give people hope after 16 years of largely being in the darkness. Many celebrated having freedom of speech again and freedom of press, and also accountability for a large number of political disappearances that occurred under the brutal regime. Immediately after August 5th, school children, parents, artists, and professionals started painting murals across the entire country to commemorate both the revolution and pay homage to those who paid the price to bring about this change. Nonetheless, the interim government and the nation faces a lot of challenges as it attempts to rebuild and renew. And there are already significant threats in that first week. For instance, a judicial coup was attempted, orchestrated by some of Awami League loyalists inside the country, and it was thwarted again by the student leaders. However, a second significant threat comes from the pervasive disinformation and propaganda that attempts to both discredit and destabilize the new movement towards democracy building in Bangladesh and the new interim government. This propaganda which is quite pervasive and multi-pronged, has spread across social media platforms since August 5th. The false narratives have been so widespread that international press, media, pundits, intellectuals, influencers, and the general public globally have unwittingly propagated many of them. Two main sources need to be highlighted in this misinformation campaign. There are first global Hindutva forces linked to India and Awami League loyalists, both inside and outside of Bangladesh. First, the groups associated with India's Hindutva regime and their allies have actively spread anti-Bangladesh sentiments around the world. This is widely believed to be a response to the fall of the Hasina government in Bangladesh, which was strongly backed by New Delhi in India, because there is much at stake for India: the potential loss of access to Bangladesh's resources, profits from industries and Indian citizens working inside Bangladesh, the usage of transportation networks to reach India's northeastern states, and security assistance targeting militant groups active in India's northeast. So therefore, it is also not only a political and an economic and ideological battlefield, but it's also worth noting that India ranks #1 in the spread of misinformation, according to the 2024 Global Risk Report issued by the World Economic Forum. In the first hour of Hasina fleeing to India, the number of tweets, for example, against Bangladesh were in the thousands out of India on the platform known as now X, but formerly as Twitter. Second, this misinformation campaign is occurring in collusion with Awami League, which has been actively engaging in disruptive politics and violence inside Bangladesh, fostering discontent and supporting these wildly misleading narratives. Their hope is that India will help reinstall Hasina in Bangladesh. But immediately and ongoing fact-checking and debunking by international media and dedicated fact-checking agencies started to set the record straight. And therefore, many of the lies, spurious claims, doctored and altered photos, and defamatory arguments were quickly responded to, but the damage continues to occur. And as a result, concerns arise about what will transpire in the months as the interim government tries to bring order into the mess that Hasina left behind. However, a new set of concerns have risen. Amid the flood of misinformation is an actual flood. Since August 20th, Bangladesh has been hit by catastrophic floods. So again, what we see is that hope that had been regained on August 5th was quickly dashed as 5 million people became devastated by very rapid onset floods, where over 24 people have been killed in the last few days. And these stats will rise as there is more deaths and devastations that need to be accounted for. So despite having to deal with the complete mess from the cronyism, corruption, unnecessary bureaucracy, and shuffles in government portfolios, the interim government still had to respond very swiftly to this flood catastrophe. It mobilized a range of resources, such as the military corps, including the Army, Navy, and various defense forces, as well as the civilian corps, in terms of galvanizing various groups and supporting individual and private efforts for rescue, recovery, relief, and rehabilitation. And they'd set up a dedicated relief fund for all flood-affected people, and they raised substantial amount of money within 2 days. In addition to this, there are hundreds of private initiatives collecting money from around the world. Students, civilians, and diasporic Bangladeshis have galvanized and united in terms of flood donations and supporting relief and rescue efforts right now. This builds on that energy of the mass uprising that ousted a dictator of 15 years within just 3 weeks. And in that 3 weeks since she's been ousted, that sense of patriotic solidarity has had to now deal with the floods. However, there are continuing forces of fragmentation and disruption. And as a result, when we talk about what is going to happen, we need to understand it in the context of wider regional geopolitics. This includes wider regional water sharing in South Asia, and in terms of thinking about concerns about ongoing efforts to reform and rebuild institutions, especially domestic institutions, among many things that need to be tackled. So in conclusion, because I wanted to keep this fairly short so that we can have more discussion time, is that we have an opportunity to rebuild democracy in Bangladesh. And everyone is trying to lend support in various ways, but they're disruptive and destabilizing forces both within and without. We need more people to come together because there's no way that we're going back to those forms of repressive and dictatorial and autocratic and violent regimes that deny people the right to have a country that they can feel free to have a say in. And I hope the international community and everyone around the world will lend support to this process, will actually listen to Bangladeshis and invite Bangladeshis to speak on issues rather than listening to outsiders or to propaganda or distorted news. There's plenty that's happening inside the country, and they're excellent experts that can help educate the world and help rebuild the country. And therefore, we just need to stand together to help support the second independence of Bangladesh. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, Mona and Daniel and everybody else for including me in this conversation. I'm very honored to share the stage with student coordinators as well. And I want to start by paying my respects to the memory of all of those people, the hundreds of students and other Bangladeshis that were basically hunted down like animals at one point in what essentially became a killing spree. And I do think it's important to remember that. So in my 5 to 7 minutes, I want to address the question of what has happened and what this means for Bangladesh and South Asia as a region. And I speak from the perspective of an ordinary student. This is a little bit of a personal account since I just happened to be in Bangladesh from July 13th to August 10th, for which I'm very grateful. But it really gave me a sense of how student struggles over quotas became suddenly our struggle, a people's struggle over the soul of the nation, not to get too dramatic. But so here's my first slide, which I took at one of those protests before August 5th. And it says, well, you can see what it says, right? So much has happened after August 5th, we're in danger of forgetting the depth and the intensity of emotions generated by 15 plus years of Hasina's rule. And two words, in the days leading up, two words, I kept hearing two words, atonko and kob. Atonko is terror. Kob is resentment. Akrosh is rage. These were the words. Terror that you could be detained by the regime if you cross them in any way, whether by publishing a cartoon or dissenting publicly on, Hasina's foreign policy as a university student, and you could be taken to the infamous Ainaghar, right? So that was there. And the knowledge that there was no recourse over 15 years, it was very, very obvious that even when you appealed outside to the global legal system, there would be no recourse. And I will come back to that point. And hence, I think, who do you go to when the police murders is, we're coming back full circle to that. But along with the rage and resentment, there was another word that I heard initially that got folded into other things, which is agun, which means fire. And, in literary production, it's about passion. It's about a desire. But agun here referred to the market and the untouchability, the way the prices of basic goods, like trying to touch the goods would burn you. And it's very interesting to see how political economy and so-called free speech comes together in the kind of anger and the crowd that the Cope people had. I found right after August 5th, there was one quote from Frantz Fanon I saw a few times in very progressive circles. But this is the quote. It's a very well-known quote that comes up. We revolt because for many reasons we can no longer breathe. But it seemed like people felt they could not breathe under the Hasina regime. So it's not really surprising that there was this dizzying change from one moment you're in a quota andolon, quota movement, to becoming a people's movement that overturns the government. And so these are, things I found on, this was again on a march before August 5th. And this says Bibek, this is by, I hate to say this, but our equivalent of a bank's fee. And he wrote, Bibek Kothai, where is the morality? And this was right during, at the point where the category of civilian lost any meaning. We saw, we were there watching video clips that were being circulated of one worse than the other. So there was the shooting at point blank range of, a young man in Rangpur in northern Bangladesh. That shooting became a turning point too. He was basically standing there daring the police to shoot, which they did, right? It was cold-blooded murder. But basically, in sitting in Bangladesh, a lot of the times I thought, am I watching Gaza or am I, or Kashmir or what? Because so many red lines were crossed when the police were shooting pellets. They were shooting at the eyes of people. In fact, the Islamia Eye Hospital now has a separate zone for people whose eyes have been damaged or who've been blinded, right? So we had footage of people cowering in, alleyways, whatever. They're just, being shot like birds, as many people said, right? So there's a kind of thingification that happened, during, what was called Bloody July, as Farhana said. And I think here is where the students were I was very, shocked at what was happening. And I just couldn't, this was not Kashmir after all. This was not Gaza. I thought we don't have a settler colonialism. But somebody, again, these are the students who did this amazing analysis, and the students had in their placards on the street a quote from an indigenous feminist activist who was disappeared, Hasina's regime. It's very famous for the disappearing and extrajudicial killings, but I don't know if she was reading Aimé Césaire or whatever, but clearly one of the things she said is, everything that is experimented on the hills will be implemented on the plains. She said this 15, 20 years ago. And that's what seemed to be happening. So, and here I should have shown this first. This is real. For those of you who know Bangla, it's a really interesting, this was on August 5th when we were walking back from Shahbag. The writing on the wall, one of them, I don't have the writing that says Kuni Hasina, killer Hasina, but it says Kamuki, what should I eat? What am I going to eat? And then it says Unnoyon Lagbena, we don't need development. We want to eat, we want to keep our bellies full, right? And various other things. So clearly this, one of the things that bolsters Hasina's regime was very much, I have a feeling I have 1 minute left. Okay, all right. Was this, I did one of the three things. Okay, I'm going to take one extra minute. One thing, external powers, the EU, the United States, whatever, very happily overlooked all the extrajudicial killings and the other violence of the Hasina regime, because I think Bangladesh plays a very important role in the global developmentalist imaginary, but also in sort of propping up a certain kind of global Islamophobia that I think, Farhana really has her finger on with respect to India, which is that Hasina both, had this economic growth without development, of course, that really only helped a certain group of people, but she could project this image of women's empowerment, Muslim women's empowerment, which in Bangladeshi terms, the global neoliberal sort of feminists and others lapped up, ate. Bangla bolle খেয়েছে, they ate that, right? But she was also saying very successfully that without her, Bangladesh would become Talibanized. It would become another Afghanistan or another Pakistan. And she used global Islamophobia, and particularly, Islamophobia with the Hindutva regime, to her advantage in a way that I think worked brilliantly until it didn't. Right? Because for people, if this revolution, this uprising, whatever you want to say, has succeeded, it has nothing to do with external power. It is all the agency of Bangladeshi students and other Bangladeshis who went on the streets, certainly. So since my time is up, I have a lot more to say about the nationalist story that the students really unveiled for the hollowness of what it was. The Razakar versus Mukti Jodha, but perhaps we can talk about that in the Q&A. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, the panelists, the participants in the webinar, and the organizers, particularly the Cornell-Syracuse Consortium and the Cornell South Asia Program for offering me this opportunity to share my perspective on it's very important and historic event that has that took place in August, in July and August in Bangladesh. After having an excellent introduction by Professor Sultana and also some very insightful perspective from Professor Siddiqi, who had some experience on ground, witnessing the happenings, my focus will be basically trying to understand why it happened at this very point, why it didn't happen earlier. So I'll try to use some political science frameworks to understand why and how this movement was successful in an extremely repressive state environment. And if there's some time, I'll try to focus on what needs to be done to prevent democratic backsliding, but that's not a priority for now. We can talk more about in the question and answer session. So the thing to know is that Bangladesh became like a personalist autocracy in the last 10 to 15 years, right? And the challenge with the personalist autocracy is that there is no easy escape. In the political science literature, it shows that only natural death exit is kind of the common way to get free of this sort of repressive state environment when there is a personalist autocracy, right? There was no effective opposition, so any effort by the opposition was sidelined, and there was huge targeted repression, and there's a culture of fear, terror, and trauma, right? Just to give you an example, there were about 4,900,000 politically motivated legal cases put on the oppositions to put them silent. So it was very, very extremely repressive state environment. Why students could succeed. So I'll emphasize on three factors. The first one is Generation Z, right? Everyone is talking about how the movement was led by Generation Z. When I was trying to understand what that actually means, so I found that this is somewhat characteristically of the fact that this generation is less amenable to the culture of fear, terror, and repression. They are less motivated by logic of consequences, so they don't care much about what the cost or benefit will come out of it. But they're more driven by a sense of social awareness and a heightened sense of authenticity and inclusivity. So if you look at how the slogans and the way they were trying to communicate their anger, they were not actually afraid of what's going to happen. They were more about what they should do in that environment, right? So the state repression, whatever the repressive apparatus is, could not act as a deterring factor in their participation despite high cost. Second factor, I've said that they made participation very inclusive, highly inclusive, unlike many other previous movements. If you look at the social hierarchy and how it interacts in with state repression in Bangladesh, you'll see that usually the victims are educated lower or middle class people, lower middle class people. And the mobilization comes from that segment of the society. The upper middle class enjoys benefits no matter who is in power and generally avoids confrontation with the ruling party. So that's the general case. So what is the difference now? With Generation Z, the segmentation did not work because they participated across social classes. If you look at the diverse range of participants, students from private universities, English medium schools, many of them have like social elite backgrounds. So that started with some previous moments in 2018, I guess, but this is kind of a new phenomenon in Bangladesh. Why is this important? Because this forced the upper middle class social or political power elites to be active, at least a good percentage of it to be activated, to be vocal about state repression. And forced the government to be indiscriminate in state repression. So the state repression directed now from exclusively low classes to also include upper classes. So such repression is more costly because the social hierarchy, when, like in Bangladesh, when people were killed, like the opposition, or for instance, people were killed, many people of President Islam was killed, but the power elites were totally silent. And they were not made activated by those sort of repression because the state was not losing legitimacy even after, like perpetrating those violence. But after, when they're targeting the elite class and upper middle class, then a different sort of power elites got activated. That's kind of my analysis. I think another factor that we need to keep in mind is the role of online activists, especially those who are actively creating short visual contents from abroad. The government was actually trying to propagate using different mechanisms to educate the young generation to the narratives that suits their sort of agenda. So they were basically controlling print and electronic media, effectively controlling those houses. And then they were also controlling to some extent book curriculum, publishing houses, and even the conventional entertainment industry, using movies to sort of propagate. But the good thing about Generation Z, that they don't care about those conventional media much. What they care more is very short, very brief content, visual content created in the social media. So they're people who are actually creating content from abroad, they could sort of, engage this Generation Z. So their priors and perceptions are formulated by the virtual content in social media and to some extent by the OTT platforms. The third factor I want to emphasize is the role of the armed forces. The police was very politicized, and they were the key perpetrators in shooting and killing people and enduring them. There were some cases of military involvement, but mostly they showed a reasonable amount of restraint. And what is important is that even when they were patrolling in favor of the government, people were kind of at ease because they know that police violence cannot cross a limit in the presence of the military. And the second factor in the military is, because of the strong organizational culture, the government could not politicize it completely, unlike police. So even if the top level, like promotions and appointments, were made politically, on political grounds, the low, officer level, entry level recruitments were quite good, quite fair in the military. So that created a bottom-up pressure on the top level leadership in the military not to use force against the people. Yeah, there were a few meetings that the army chief conducted with the young officers. In most of the cases, young officers were vehemently opposing using force against the protesters. So that kind of deterred the top leadership of the military to go against the protesters. Okay, I'll just finish it in 30 seconds. Finally, I think there was also some pressure from I think the United Nations was very active in terms of communicating their concerns about human rights violation to the army, specifically after they saw that there are some UN-marked vehicles were patrolling in the protests. So, and that, the Bangladesh military is one of the top troop contributing entity in the world, and they have a huge stake in not antagonizing the United Nations, and also by that vein, the United States in sort of having a reputational cost that might make them face issues in the future, right? So since my time is over, I'm not gonna focus on the things that I think need to be done, but like me and Professor Sabrina Karim, we wrote an op-ed on this, like what needs to be done, what sort of reforms needs to be done at this point to prevent democratic backsliding in Bangladesh. I encourage you to read. And I can go over some of the points if you have questions during the question and answer session. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. So I know we have kind of gathered here together for like talking about the July Revolution. And as Professor Bhan has already kind of introduced me, I do work on student movements in the 1950s and 1960s. And so this particular revolution was had a lot of information overload almost on me. So what the biggest thing that I took away from there, and to begin with, I was in Bangladesh throughout July, and I was there when the ex-Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina, she resigned. So what was really kind of jarring is how it began as a quota reform movement, and then how it slowly kind of built onto this momentum where it's the fall of the whole government. So before going into my experience, I'll first start with like a macro kind of a look at where we were at the moment during Hasina's regime. So there was a lot of creation of binary categories, especially in regards to the War of 71. So categories such as freedom fighters or Mukti Jodha, and then categories such as traitors or Rajakars. Rajakars are specifically, and it matters because like the word Rajakar then gets used in a very different manner during the July Revolution. So Rajakars were people who were recruited by the Pakistani regime in 1971 war from among the Bengalis during the war. So in many ways, that word kind of categorizes a group of people who are kind of like national traitors. So in many ways, by emphasizing on these categories, the Army League and Hasina regime, they kind of tried to legitimize power and hold on to the mandate over the people indefinitely. And they were kind of successful for a very long time. But what this July Revolution kind of does is dissolve all these binaries, all these categories, and brings into focus the idea of liberation into this discursive space, and it challenges and analyzes the students. They challenge, they analyze these categories in more nuanced ways. So for example, and I think that was one of the key moments in July that really kind of, and I think as Professor Dina Siddiqi was talking about, like it gave that momentum, that fire, that agun to this movement, was when the students started addressing themselves as Rajakar. So there were a lot of questions around it, and it was like one of those very kind of controversial moments in the movement itself. So So the main slogan that kind of took a lot of momentum was "Tumi ke, ami ke, Rajakar, Rajakar, ke boleche, Shoirachar, Shoirachar," which means who are you, who am I? We are Rajakars. Who has called us that? Dictator. So Rajakar in itself then takes on this meaning of being a dissident against the fascist Army League regime. So over time, they take on more of these like categories, binary categories, and almost like adopt and remodel those categories into becoming a part of their movement. They kind of claim those categories and change those categories and basically kind of expose the fascist nature of this government. Because again, like as we have already kind of heard a lot of analysis on this as well, that a lot of these categories were just employed to legitimize Army League and Sheikh Hasina being in power. So there's a lot to say, and as a historian, there's a lot to say about what we get fixated on and what events or what categories we allow to gain historical agency, which then later on takes on this political agenda, and how to kind of dissolve it. And the only way it seems is to have a revolution. And in this case, it's the students who kind of come in and kind of try to dissolve those meanings. So now on a more personal note, on a more micro level, I was working in a personal archive during this point, and I was a bit away from Dhaka, but so while I was in the archive, I could hear all kinds of processions, students going out, and these very like peaceful protests against the quota system. And so before the curfew, I was frequenting the archives. And while I was doing that, there was a very like, I would say a very aggressive kind of like a confrontation that I had. So there was this visit from a police officer and his team. And mind you, this is an archive that's not state-led, that's completely personally owned. So this police officer, he's there to maybe like supervise and understand what kind of research goes on through this archive. So the archivist, he is a professor. He introduced me as a former teacher in BRAC University. So then one of the team members, he actually kind of stopped when he was introducing me. He was like, "Oh, okay, so you are a teacher in BRAC University." And this was important because like the week before, there was a shooting that the police kind of went into the campus and shot at the students. So he was like very kind of intrigued in a way. So he was asking me like, "Oh, so you were a teacher in BRAC University. What do you work on?" And I told him that I work on student movements in the 1950s and 1960s. And yeah, so I'm here to kind of look at those things. And he suddenly just laughed at me and he said like, "Oh, so good, because there is good andolon or good protests that are being done by your students. So it's great for you." And so it kind of really like brought to focus how the capillaries of power work in these situations, this careless laughter, this kind of desensitized way of looking at almost like this, again, like this murder spree that the government was going on, and to look at me and say like, "Oh, your students are doing great protests," and I know like the police have been shooting at them. It was a very kind of difficult moment. And then so for me, it is a great moment. It's a amazing, like exciting moment for me to see that the students have finally won in many ways, even though it's a very precarious moment we are living in right now. With the interim government and all of that, but it's a great time to be alive, to be honest. And so the fact that we are going to talk a bit about firsthand witnesses of this revolution. So I'm excited to hear from Bidita, from Amar, about the July Revolution and how they participated in different capacities, how students organized, how students almost like fought with their parents to be out in the open while there was shooting going on, how they also remodeled the discourse around all these like big categories like liberation, freedom fighters, martyrs, traitors, just and in the end to topple a fascist regime. So it's exciting, and I'm here for it. Thank you so much.
So I went to the protest on 16th of July and 18th of July. And so basically, I'm just gonna share my experience. And I was also there on August 4th, August 2nd, and 5th a little bit. So basically, things were really different at the end of July, starting from the middle. So I'm gonna start from 15th July. That is when things got worst. That is the day when police and Bangladesh Chhatra League or Bangladesh Student League attacked on the student protesters of Dhaka University, where the main protest was going on. So the university students started the protest against the quota to reform that system, quota system, and they were doing peaceful protest, and all of a sudden the student league, which they're also students, university students, but they represent the government. They're part of the government, and basically they work to just whatever Hasina says, or her ministers and all of that. But they're basically students, and they're much more aggressive, and they killed people. That's the short of it. And the police, who are supposed to be there to protect the students, because the Chhatra League is also students. It's the Chhatra League. Chhatra means student. So they were actually protecting those students who were attacking the protesters. So basically, they were also attacking the protesters, and that's when things got ugly. That was 15th of July, and after that, it was no longer just what university students were doing. It was also about how all the other school and college. College means 11th and 12th grade. We call that college in Bangladesh, and how they also started to join the movement, because why would they hurt their brothers and sisters simply for protesting peacefully against a quota reform, a quota system? So when I joined, I've never actually been in this kind of aggressive protest before. I was keeping news online of the bloodbath and everything. I was seeing how the police was treating the protesters and everything. But I don't know why. I expected things to be a bit different where I was. I live in Uttara in Dhaka, and we don't necessarily have a lot of universities here, except for a few private universities, but they're also kind of far from where I am. So we basically have school and college students here. So basically anyone below the university level, those kinds of institutions. And we are out on the streets just with placards and chanting slogans. And still the police was so brutal on us. It's like that they were treating us like zombies, we're ruining the ecosystem, we're ruining the country, and the more they can kill us. Yes, they used bullets. Yeah, they used rubber bullets, but they shot us in our eyes and foreheads. They targeted those parts of our bodies where if you get injured enough, you're going to die. I saw people die in front of me, and children, they're younger than me. I know that they're from 8th grade, 10th grade, and it's not something that's stomachable. That it's just that bad. And they know that we're this young. We're literally children. Still they attacked us like that, we're animals, we're zombies, and they're doing a great service to humanity by killing us and treating us like that. So I got injured on 18th of July, and I was kind of contemplating my choices. I've never been to this kinds of aggressive protest before, knowing that it's peaceful, but still. And I was feeling very defeated. And there was all these news about how the hospitals are overflowing with bodies, dead bodies, and people are afraid, their families are afraid to come and claim their bodies, their children's bodies, because what if the police then, there was a crackdown going on where they were going to just random houses and bringing out students and giving false allegations and taking them to jail. So the parents were so afraid to claim their children's bodies. The hospitals were just overflowing with them. There were students there admitted with no proper care because there was not enough staff, and people couldn't travel at that time to hospitals because of the condition in the roads and the hostility of the police and Bangladesh Chhatra League. They were the ones with all the weapons, and basically we the students, we just had like tree branches, sticks, stones, and they were with the rubber bullets, tear gas, actual bullets, knives, you name it, axes, whatever they can find. The most severe weapons were used by the Chhatra League because, as you know, they're like the gundas of the government. They're like, what do I say? They're just the gangsters of the government. So they're allowed to use whatever. They don't even need license for those weapons at that point. And so I was really devastated. And that's when I decided that it would be better if I could work on the medical side of the things. So I had friends in medical schools, and we talked about it, how we can do something to help these people. Like, they're basically people just like, and they don't have any place to go. So why don't we do something for them? And hospitals were also afraid of admitting these injured protesters because like the police are going to come and, you know, arrest them as well. So at our school, we a certain room called the parents' shade, where the parents or the guardians come and wait for their children to take them home after school. So because the schools were all shut down, we decided that that would be a really good place to hold like a medical camp. And that's what we did. We collected donations to help the protesters, to provide them with first aid. So we did that on 4th and 5th of August. And our medical team on 5th of August, if you know, we had like a march from all over Dhaka to Shahbag. And they had like this one demand that we want the government gone. We don't want any more killings. Like, forget quota reform, forget whatever we were asking before. We cannot accept this massacre. So we wanted the government to be gone, and everyone with that one demand, they were gathering. So there was a huge procession. And from Uttara, we decided that, you know, since people are going to be traveling on foot, so we should have a medical team go with these people so that if they get injured in the streets, we can help them. And that's what we did. It was a very hectic 2 days, 4th and 5th August, like collecting donations, managing the transportation, and all these medical students, they're not necessarily they're not necessarily protesters. They're more on the like volunteers to help the protesters. So how do we ensure their safety and all of that? It was very tough. And convincing the parents to let us fight, to let us go out, to let the medical students out, that was the real challenge. Because, as you know, our parents, we're the Gen Zs, but they're not habituated to the social media the way we are. Their algorithms were mostly showing them the social media propaganda that the government was spreading at that time. Like, they were saying things like, we're gonna have the army brush fire all the protesters on 5th August, so make sure your kids don't come out, and all of that. They were scaring the heck out of our parents, and I couldn't go with the procession to help my medical team, to manage the medical team on 5th August. I was only there on 4th August. So that was really devastating for me because I was really excited about that. And yeah, that's about it. I guess I'm gonna end my speech just with that. Not only there was like a little bit of a fight between, not only there was this huge fight and protest amongst the governments and the rest of the people in the country, but we also had this little mini generational war going on where the Gen Zs are like really proactive, and we had to continuously convince the like older generation to like, you guys need to step up, because they had more power, they had more weight to their words and everything, but they were just so afraid to step out of their comfort zone because they were so used to this regime keeping them quiet, just subduing them all the time. And then we, the younger generation, were just out there fighting. They were so uncomfortable with it. And so, yeah, that's about it. Thank you so much for inviting me today.
Everyone, I think it would be comfortable for me to speak in Bengali. So first of all, I apologize to everyone that I think I'll speak in Bengali, and Farhana Apu will help me out with translation. So এই ছবিটা হচ্ছে আমাদের 15 তারিখ সন্ধ্যার সময়কার ছবি, যেদিন হচ্ছে আমরা প্রথম ঢাকা বিশ্ববিদ্যালয়ে আমরা অ্যাটাকড হই ছাত্রলীগ বাহিনীর দ্বারা। তো এই সময়টাতে আমি রাস্তার ফুটপাতে বসেছিলাম। তো আমাদের শত 100-150 মানুষজনের উপরে হচ্ছে যারা হচ্ছে অলরেডি ইনজুর্ড, ঢাকা ভার্সিটিতে ভর্তি ছিল। ওখানে রক্তাক্ত, রক্ত, চিৎকার, আহাজারি, এর মধ্যে হসপিটালের ভেতর থেকে আমি কোনো ছবি নিতে পারিনি। সো আমি হসপিটালের জায়গাগুলো কোনোভাবে ম্যানেজ করে যখন বাইরে আসলাম, তখন বাইরে দেখলাম যে এরকম একটা আকাশ, অ্যান্ড মেটাফরিক্যালি আমার কাছে খুবই কেমন যেন লাগলো যে হচ্ছে জুলাইয়ে হঠাৎ এরকম একটা আকাশ। অ্যান্ড আমার কাছে মনে হচ্ছিল যে ফার্স্ট দিন আমরা যখন দেখলাম যে এরকম একটা রক্তাক্ত একটা পরিবেশ, সো সেই রক্তাক্ত পরিবেশের দিন খুবই মেটাফরিক্যালি মনে হচ্ছে যে ওরকম একটা আকাশ, যে সামনেও বোধহয় আসলে খুব কঠিন একটা সময় যাচ্ছে বা অনেক বেশি ব্লাড শেডিং হবে আর কি। সো এটা হচ্ছে ওই সময়কার আসলে আকাশ। সো আমি এটা আমার ফার্স্ট দিন আন্দোলনে, সো এটা দিয়ে আমি আমার ইয়েটা শুরু করছি আসলে আলাপটা।
I can translate that. So this is the first picture he took. This is on 15th of July. And this was the first day the students were kind of attacked. And so he went to the hospitals, and there was a lot of cry and uproar around the kind of violence that happened. And when he came out of the hospital, he saw this red sky, and it was almost kind of a metaphorical moment for him, looking at the sky, thinking about the kind of days that might be ahead, which might be not so good, which might be equally violent or even worse. So yeah, Amar.
তো একটু সময় যেহেতু স্বল্প, আমরা একটু অর্গানাইজিং পার্ট নিয়ে একটু কথা বলতে চাই। যে হচ্ছে আমরা অলরেডি বিদিতা বলেছে যে হচ্ছে আমাদের স্কুল এবং কলেজ, প্রথমত এটা ভার্সিটির স্টুডেন্টদের আন্দোলন ছিল, পরে হচ্ছে স্কুল এবং কলেজ তারাও যোগদান করে। আমি একদিন খুব, এটা হচ্ছে 16 তারিখ, আমি খুব ক্লোজলি অবজার্ভ করার চেষ্টা করি যে হচ্ছে কিভাবে হচ্ছে স্কুল এবং কলেজের স্টুডেন্টরা তারা হচ্ছে রাস্তার ভেতরে এই একটা ছোট জায়গা থেকে তারা কিভাবে বাসা থেকে বের হয়ে একজন একজন করে, 2 জন করে, 4 জন করে, 5 জন করে একটা গ্রুপ, এবং গ্রুপ থেকে আসলে তারা কিভাবে একটা বড় মিছিল বা একটা আন্দোলন তারা তৈরি করে। সো ফার্স্ট অফ অল প্রত্যেকটা স্টুডেন্ট, প্রত্যেকটা স্কুলেই দেখা যায় যে ওদের একটা হোয়াটসঅ্যাপ বা একটা টেলিগ্রাম গ্রুপ থাকে। সেইখানে স্কুলের বাচ্চারা হচ্ছে ওদেরকে ওদের নেতৃত্বে জায়গায় থাকে, ওদের হয়তো কোনো ইমিডিয়েট সিনিয়র যে আসলে কলেজে পড়ে। আবার কলেজের মধ্যে যারা আসলে একত্রিত হয় তাদের তাদের নেতৃত্বে জায়গায় থাকে ইমিডিয়েটলি তাদের যে ইউনিভার্সিটি সিনিয়র। সো এরকম আমি 2-1 জনের রোল দেখতে পেয়েছি যারা আসলে তারা যে স্কুলে পড়তো কিংবা তারা যে কলেজে পড়তো তাদের জুনিয়রদেরকে অ্যাড করার ক্ষেত্রে, এবং তাদের একটা জোন থাকতো, যেই জোনে হচ্ছে তারা তাদের আগের দিন সেট করা থাকতো যে আমরা সেই জোনে গিয়ে আসলে দেখা করব। সো এরকম অনেকগুলো ছোট ছোট জোন, সেটা আসলে মিলিত হয়ে একটা বড় জোন, যেটা হচ্ছে আমরা একটা হাব বলতে পারি, যেটা একটা হতে পারে একটা 4 রাস্তার মোড়, যেটা আশেপাশে অনেক স্কুল আছে। সো এরকম 4-5টা জোন হচ্ছে ওরা একত্রিত হয়ে ওরা একটা হাবে গিয়ে মিলিত হতো। সো আপু এতটুকু আপনি একটু ট্রান্সলেট করুন।
So now he's talking about how students would organize, and they would basically like mark zones as areas where, let's say, some students would come together, and then together the procession would go towards a bigger hub, which they would mark as a bigger group of people joining from different zones. And usually the leadership, like, because this is not a centrally kind of guided, this wasn't a centrally guided protest exactly, because you won't see one single leader. So you would have, like, for example, if these are like school students who are joining the protest, then there would be one senior college student who would be kind of guiding them through Telegram or WhatsApp. And the same is true for college students who might be being guided by a university student. So there was that kind of almost like a link between colleges, schools, and universities, and also spaces in the city. So again, Amar is more talking about Dhaka. So within Dhaka, they would be kind of dividing spaces as zones and bigger areas where different processions would kind of come together as hubs.
And যেটা হচ্ছে এই পরিকল্পনাগুলো হচ্ছে একেবারে হচ্ছে পুঙ্খানুপুঙ্খানুভাবে আমরা আসলে বাস্তবায়ন করতে পারতাম না। দেখা যেত যে ইনিশিয়ালি আগের দিন যে জায়গায় প্ল্যান হচ্ছে সেটা হচ্ছে পরের দিন অবভিয়াসলি সেই জায়গাটাতে আমরা দাঁড়াতে পারতাম না, কারণ পুলিশ আগে থেকে জেনে যেত। সো দেখা যাচ্ছে যে আমরা ওই প্ল্যান অনুযায়ী ওই জায়গায় গ্যাদার হতে পারতাম না। সো হচ্ছে দেখা যেত যে পুলিশ অনেককে ধরে নিয়ে যাচ্ছে সেখানে আসলে, কিংবা কাউকে কাউকে হয়তো মারধর করছে। তো ইনস্ট্যান্টলি আমাদেরকে প্ল্যান পরিবর্তন করতে হতো, এবং আমরা দেখা যেত যে আমরা ইনস্ট্যান্টলি কোনো একটা হাব তৈরি কোনো একটা জোন তৈরি করতেছি চেঞ্জ করে, সেইখানে হয়তো মিলিত হচ্ছি। কিংবা যদি আমাদের কোনোভাবে আমাদের সেই মেইন হাবটা আসলে ওয়ার্কআউট নাও করে, আশেপাশের কোনো একটা হাবে গিয়ে আমরা জয়েন করতেছি। বেসিক্যালি আমাদের প্রোটেস্ট অন টাইম শুরু হইতো না, একটু দেরি হইতো, কারণ আসলে এই বাধা বিপত্তি থাকার কারণে। কিন্তু কেউ আসলে ঘরে ফিরতো না, সবাই আসলে আশেপাশে ঘুরঘুর করতে হতো, চায়ের দোকানে কিংবা দেয়ালের আড়ালে কিংবা হচ্ছে হোটেলের মধ্যে, মানে নানাভাবে আশেপাশে থাকতো। এবং দেখা যাচ্ছে যে কেউ যদি আসলে সাহস করে, আমরা একটা ছবি দেখতে পাচ্ছি এখানে হয়তো 30-40 জন বা 50 জন, কেউ যদি সাহস করে একবার রাস্তার মাঝখানে এসে একটা মিছিল শুরু করতে পারতো, দেখা যেত যে উইদিন 2 or 3 মিনিটস সেখানে 300, 400 বা 500 মানুষ আশপাশ থেকে খুব দ্রুত এসে জড়ো হতো, এবং আমরা হচ্ছে সেই আমাদের যে হাবটা সেটাকে আমরা দখলে নিয়ে নিতাম।
So, for example, now he's going into like how the organizing itself happened more like very randomly. These were like sporadic gatherings because suddenly it would be like in certain spaces, obviously, once they're marked as protest gatherings, the police would come by. So gatherings would not be kind of held to one place. So this was also pretty like random choice of spaces. But the main thing is the students never left the streets. And they always kind of, so if there was 2 or 3 people who would come in the middle of some street, there would be some students or the other hiding behind, let's say, in shops or behind some walls, and they would just immediately join. So these were like very random, like it wasn't kind of organized very kind of in a fixed way. It was always like sudden random gatherings that were happening all across the city.
অ্যান্ড আমাদের এই আন্দোলনটা আসলে যেহেতু প্রথমত স্টুডেন্টদের আন্দোলন হিসেবে শুরু হলো, দেখা যাচ্ছে যে পরবর্তীতে সব ধরনের বা সব শ্রেণীর মানুষদের একটা ইনভলভমেন্ট ছিল। অ্যান্ড আমরা এখানে আমাদের রিক্সাওয়ালাদের কিংবা হচ্ছে আমরা ডক্টরসদের কথা বলতে পারি, লয়ার্সদের কথা বলতে পারি। আমরা একটা সময় যখন প্রচুর আমাদের নামে মামলা হচ্ছিল, লয়ার্সরা তাদের সার্ভিস ওপেন করে দিয়েছিল, যে হচ্ছে যারা আসলে জেলে আছে কিংবা যারা আসলে যাদের লিগাল সার্ভিস দরকার ওপেন করে দিচ্ছিল। ডক্টররা আসলে বিভিন্ন জায়গাতে আসলে ফ্রি সার্ভিস দেওয়ার জন্য তারা মানে ভ্রাম্যমান জোন তৈরি করেছিল। আমরা রিক্সা পুলারদের দেখতে পাচ্ছি। তারপর হচ্ছে এখানে আমাদের মাদ্রাসার স্টুডেন্টদের একটা ছবি আছে, মানে ডিফারেন্ট ব্যাকগ্রাউন্ডের মানুষ, তারা বেসিক্যালি ডিসক্রিমিনেশন অ্যান্ড মানে অন্যায় এবং বৈষম্যের বিরুদ্ধে হচ্ছে আসলে সবাই আসলে একটা স্বার্থে এবং একটা ইয়েতে। প্রথমত তারা আসলে স্টুডেন্টদের আন্দোলনে থাকলে প্রথমত তারা প্রতিবাদ করে, কিন্তু একটা সময় যখন অত্যাচার নির্যাতনের মাত্রা বেড়ে যায় তখন হচ্ছে তারা সবাই আসলে রাস্তায় নেমে আসে।
Yes, so now we are getting into, or Amar is trying to say that it started off as a student movement, but over time this became a mass movement, and that's because different classes of people from different professions basically just opened up like free services or just like help the students in whichever way they could. Pictures like this, for example, it's showing how a rickshaw puller is basically again a very much a part of the movement, and they help the students with, let's say, mobility. Then as later on arrests were increasing and there were more cases on students, there were legal services, or let's say lawyers who would give free services and help the students out with kind of services to make them understand their rights and help them out with not getting arrested in many scenarios. So yeah, there were many kinds of people who joined, and it's simply out of the love for the movement. And yes, Amar, anything else?
I think, yeah. ধন্যবাদ. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'll stop sharing.
Thank you. Thank you to our wonderful panelists for such an insightful set of remarks. I feel so energized by all of this. And I'm sure everybody else who's here feels the same way. We have a set of questions. In the interest of time, we might be able to get to some of them. I know there's been an active back and forth between the participants and the attendees, but for the benefit of the entire the entire set who's here, I'd like to perhaps start with this one question. So I feel many questions have touched on this, this vision of inclusivity that has been brought up by a number of panelists, and people are wondering what does it look like ahead, right? What is the future ahead? So one of the questions from Tasfiya Tasneem asked, for example, and I'm quoting the question, after returning from Bangladesh to the US, I received one question from many people here, and that was why the students were against DEI initiatives or quota systems, because this was sort of the news they received from international media. So what would be the thoughts of the panelists on this, on how DEI, the way we understand it in the US, aligns with the quota system that Hasina was so invested in establishing? And it's one of those, again, misinformation bits that I do think might need some more belaboring from the panelists. So if you could quickly address that, that would be great. And anybody who's interested in can take it on.
I think we could both do it, but do you want to start and I can? Sorry, I'm talking to you as though there aren't 10 other people. Let me very quickly just say then, since I'm a quota system, the quota system in the Bangladeshi constitution was put in to help so-called backward or underprivileged populations. That is the word used in the constitution, or was. But the idea was just like the reservations in India and equal opportunity here. The idea was you're helping people who, for various historical reasons, because of historical injustices, need extra support, need extra access. What the Hasina regime did was actually turn that whole thing around and make it into make the quota system a way for her to basically consolidate her power. Because if the Mukti Jodha, right, freedom fighters, they weren't necessarily a backward population, right, at all. And certainly there's no reason why their children or grandchildren should be. So in fact, they were an honored, if rather neglected, population, right? But honored discursively, for sure. But there was nothing economic or social about that. So she really turned that around. So, and she made it more and more. The more I think her regime was undermined by these various other things, the stronger her emphasis on the quotas became. I mean, having 30% for a group who are not, which goes from a farmer to somebody who might have owned 3 houses in Gulshan, they're all part of this group called Mukti Jodha, wartime freedom fighters. So it made no sense. And I think what the students did was they really began to reject that idea as, they turned that idea around. They showed how hollow that idea was. And the students were not against all quotas. They wanted a reform in the quota system. One of the things, there was a lot of women in this movement. What I thought was really interesting is the women said, we don't need a women's quota anymore. We're fine with that. We see that there are other quotas that are much more important. I thought that was interesting too. I was actually going to get Farhana to talk to. I don't know if you want to add more to that.
Just very quickly, the quota movement was quite abused, the way Dina has just described, but it was also a way to actually not be DEI at all. There are many instances where it was set up to help, for instance, indigenous people, Adivasis, right? Or in terms of various ethnic, religious, sexuality-based, like hijras, actual minorities who face discrimination in society were not necessarily being helped by the system. And in a country of fairly high youth unemployment, to distort public jobs into these kind of cabals of support to bolster her regime were perceived as deeply unequal. That's how it started. Then it became a much wider issue of lack of accountability and transparency. And then it became about violence and revolution, and the one demand that she step down because the dictatorship was so multi-pronged. But that was a tip, and then it just became a much bigger issue.
Thank you, Dina and Farhana. We can move on to the other question, which I think might be for more for Tasnuwa and Amar. So in what ways do you think there's an asymmetry of civic engagement or political representation in areas of Bangladesh outside of Dhaka that without access to educational institutions, which were at the heart of the student liberation movement? If so, in what ways did activists attempt to bridge the gaps in participation from Bangladeshis in more remote areas or without access to literacy or education? And this is a question from Zanaya Hussain.
Sure. So I'll answer and I'll try to answer. So basically, what we tried to, what the coordinators of the protest tried to do. So they were actually mobilizing the university students across the countries. So we have universities in remote areas as well, like in Chattogram and then Khulna, Rangpur. And so as it was mostly focused towards university students, that's where most of the hotspots were. So that's how they were communicating. And those university students later communicated that to the regions. So as Ammar Bhai explained, that we had zones and districts, like we had our own like areas divided for a more successful procession or protest. And that is how like people in those regions in the universities, they like slowly communicated with the school and college students like, hey, we need support from you. So if you're able to join us, please join. So that was how they were communicating. And okay, let me just read that question one more time. Okay, and yeah, that was how mainly the things were coordinated mostly. And the thing was that most people, like as you know, Gen Zs, we have access to technology. So it was us, because most of the like arrangement of the protests were done through social media. So it was the Gen Zs who were getting the news first, and then they were like try to convey it to the other generations of the people in their communities. That's why that's what when I mentioned that we had like a little bit of a fight between the generations, because they were so scared, because they had seen these kind of injustices before, but they haven't necessarily done this kind of protest. Like they never came out into the streets. But the younger generations were like, look, we're seeing this kind of atrocities are happening in the capital, so we need to go there and support them. And that's where like a little bit of a conflict also happened. But yeah, mostly the university students were like contacted first, and then they communicated in their regions.
Thank you, Tasnuwa. Amar, would you like to say a few words?
না, এই পার্টটাতে আই গেস আমার কিছু বলার নেই।
I think I got that. Anybody else who wants to add to what we've already heard, please feel free.
So I could kind of add, because I was listening to this again, another protester who was from Magura, which is away from Dhaka and like all the central zones. And she was kind of explaining how even the Chhatra League, so even the political goons would be sitting in front of institutions, not only in Dhaka, but in different parts of Bangladesh. They would just be sitting there. And as I think Tasnuba was trying to say, like talk about how it was communicated across the students through the different mediums. So at Dhaka University, again, you have students from different parts of the country. And if they could communicate with the students who were in other parts, they would be doing that. And so this student, she also kind of, she was a school student from Magura, and she had kind of talked about how it kind of did start with seeing the political goons, then feeling this almost like this anger for them not being able to even get inside their own schools because they're always sitting in the gates. And then they had to protest. So and then they kind of got involved with the movement. And we still do have threads that are pretty active among students. And you could see the different channels through which they were talking with each other and maintaining like communication resources, where to hide, where to go if things were getting worse. And it was across regions. It wasn't just in Dhaka.
Thank you, Farhana. Dina?
Oh.
I thought you unmuted yourself.
Oh, sorry, I did. I guess one of the things about this that I saw, and I'm not speaking with great authority here, but it seemed to me that this was different precisely because it was a countrywide mobilization. So the first death that was televised, I call it, that we saw of Abu Said happened in Rangpur, which we might not have usually paid attention to in Dhaka, I hate to say. Everything is so capital centric. But that killing, that very cold-blooded murder that kept going around, that we all saw on our phones, was a very important moment. And the distance between Dhaka and Rangpur did collapse. Partly it was because of social media. But I think there was something about the way in which the Hasina regime, as you were all pointing out, managed to take over all institutions all over the country. This was part of the patronage politics, that she eviscerated institutions, not just the parliament, not just the BGMEA, the garment workers, but just all over. Right? So her power, her goons were all over, and people were rising up all over. And I think people in Dhaka, the younger students in Dhaka, I've heard, were very, aware of not making this a Dhaka-centric thing. I mean, the reason, and I've just been reading somewhere else, is not necessarily even my analysis, but the march to Dhaka from all over the country, that really the day before, the call for a march to Dhaka was something that on the day Hasina fell, the night before, there was a curfew. People came from all over the country to that march because it was very clear that this was a countrywide thing. So it's not the usual rural-urban divide, at least momentarily it wasn't. That would be my analysis. At least, from sitting in Dhaka.
So we might have time for just one more question. And this question, I feel, it's a broader question, doesn't only, of course, pertain to Bangladesh, but I think Bangladesh right now is showing us the way forward. So maybe this is a question that we can get some answers to. And this is from Yunus Muhib, who says, in the era of the extractive capitalist system, populist culture, and entrenched inequality in society, how may democracy look in the context of Bangladesh? We have been striving for democratic practices since 1991, but it is necessary to ask, democracy for whom? Because such a process, albeit questionable, led to the landslide victory of the previous regime in 2008. What went wrong? And anybody who wants to take it on, please do.
I can just get us started off with the quick points, but I'm sure others have really important pointers to give, but I'm also mindful of time. So this is a really complex question because if you start talking about extractive capitalist system, we need to first understand what are the sources of that extractive process and who are the capitalists involved. But then, what do we mean by populist culture? And then the entrenched inequality. So what does democracy look like when all of these things collide? So we do have a very kind of hierarchical society. There's a lot of vertical patron-client relationships. We don't necessarily see that lateral democracy, which is what the student movement showed and demonstrated in practice or praxis. And I think that gave a lot of people hope that it is possible. And even despite, I was a student when 1990, 91, when the former military dictator Ershad was ousted, right? And that felt like that, again, that sense of hope that we're going to have a democratic election. And we thought we did because it was a caretaker government. Now we have an interim government, which is slightly different. It is also mandated to hold elections. But when do you hold those elections and what does democracy look like when there is such a corrupted culture over 16 years of cronyism and nepotism and lack of transparency and inaccountability and extrajudicial killings and entire power grabs like banks, just the culture of looting through capitalist systems, to the financial crimes. I noticed that was another question. So recovering those financial resources, I think having some sort of prosecutorial system to recover those, and that means judicial districts of other countries where these assets are being held. They're owed to the Bangladesh government, to the Bangladesh people. So that's one arm of it. But within the country, I think it's really important to ask that question, that one of the many parts of the complex question Anza asks is democracy for whom? If it does not mean democracy for the most oppressed people, then it is not really democracy. So it has to include democracy for all minorities, especially people in the Chittagong Hill Tracts, the indigenous community. It means democracy to feel that's freedom of political association and religious association by religious and ethnic minorities, by sexual minorities, our transgender community. The Hijra community played an important critical part during this uprising. It also means the ability and right for young people to play a role and not be to be dumbed down, right? But we need to have some sort of truth and reconciliation committee, the way South Africa did, because we need more of that reparative justice and not retributive justice for a different kind of democracy to be built. But, this is much longer conversations. I'm sure we could have a webinar on it. So I'm happy to discuss one-on-one afterwards or later. Feel free to email me. I'm a professor here at Syracuse. My name is Farhana Sultana. It's not hard to find me, but I'll see if anybody else wants to comment.
Okay, I have a quick comment. Thanks, because I think you really put your finger on how complicated any possible answer to that question can be. I just want to say also, I just want to add, democracy itself is a little bit problematic and can happily coexist with inequality. So even if you had a perfectly, functioning democracy, as somebody who studies garment workers, I'm looking at it from that direction. For instance, if you have democracy without violence, but with really low paying wages and the whole global system working as it's supposed to work, you would have democracy without perhaps social justice, right? And I think we kind of, there was a question about garment workers in there and living wages. I think I do want to say that the idea of democracy being uncoupled from a narrow nationalist narrative is really important, and that's what the students have done. Democracy is not equal to getting all of the Shabagis in jail. That is not democracy, that's just, dealing with one part of history. So I think that's been a very good step. But I think now is the time, I'm not sure, you're talking about extractive capitalist systems. Now is the time, I'm not sure these debates are happening, to talk, they are happening a little bit, to talk about privatization, to talk about nationalization, to talk about the redistribution of resources and how to move forward. I agree that institutional reform, is important, but there are larger, I think, philosophical questions also we can put on the table. And they don't have, they're hard. They won't have, the democracy for whom question is very important, because you can have democracy and people can go back to the same old cycle. So I'm not sure we won't, but anyway, at least there's an opening.
Thanks, Dina. Amar, and that would be, I think, where we end this excellent webinar.
থ্যাংক ইউ। আমার মনে হয় আমরা খেয়াল করেছি যে আসলে আমাদের যে কোনো একটা সংগ্রামের পরে আসলে যেই পক্ষ বিজিত হয় তাদের দ্বারা আসলে ইতিহাস লেখা হয়। এখন আমরা দেখি যে আমাদের মুক্তিযুদ্ধের পরে ইতিহাসটা আসলে যারা লিখেছে এবং যেভাবে লিখেছে সেই ব্যাপারটা হচ্ছে আমাদের ভবিষ্যৎ রাজনীতির প্রেক্ষাপট, ফলাফল, ধরন নির্ধারণ করেছে। সো আমার মনে হয় যে আমাদের আজকে আমরা যেই সংগ্রাম বা যেই অ্যাচিভমেন্টটা আমরা অর্জন করেছি সেই জায়গায় দাঁড়িয়ে এখান থেকে আমরা যদি প্রপার ইতিহাসটা আসলে লিখতে না পারি, যেমন ধরেন আমাদের এই বিপ্লবের পিছনে, আমাদের এই অর্জনের পিছনে নানা শ্রেণীর, নানা মতাদর্শের, নানা নানা জায়গার মানুষের আসলে স্টেক হোল্ডার আছে, তারা আসলে পার্টিসিপেট করছে অ্যাক্টিভলি। কিন্তু যখন হচ্ছে যেই শ্রেণীর হাতেই বা সামনে ক্ষমতা যাক না কেন, বা এখন যাদের হাতে আছে না কেন, ইতিহাস লেখার ক্ষেত্রে এক ধরনের বৈষম্য কিংবা একটা প্রপারলি আসলে সবাইকে আসলে তুলে ধরা যায় না, বা এই ধরনের একটা প্রবণতা আসলে লক্ষ্য করা যায়। তো আমার কাছে মনে হয় সামনে আমাদের একটা সুন্দর গণতান্ত্রিক বাংলাদেশ যদি আসলে আমরা কল্পনা করতে চাই, সেক্ষেত্রে আসলে আমাদের ইতিহাস লেখার ক্ষেত্রে কিংবা যেই শ্রেণীর বা যে মতাদর্শের, যেই ডাইভার্স মতাদর্শের মানুষের এখানে পার্টিসিপেশন আছে বা কন্ট্রিবিউশন আছে, সেগুলোকে আসলে প্রপারলি যদি আমি ডকুমেন্টেশন করতে পারি, দেন আই থিঙ্ক আমরা আসলে এই আন্দোলনটা সবাই যেভাবে আসলে একটা কমন গ্রাউন্ডে এসে, একটা কমন চাওয়া থেকে এসে আমরা এখানে পার্টিসিপেট করছি। তো এই চেতনাটা আমরা আসলে সামনে বহন করে যেতে পারবো, যে আসলে আমরা ভিন্ন মতের, ভিন্ন আদর্শের, ভিন্ন চিন্তার হলেও সবাই একসাথে কোএক্সিস্ট করতে পারি। সো আই থিঙ্ক এই জায়গাটা আসলে খুব ইম্পর্টেন্ট সামনে যদি আসলে আমরা বেটার কিছু করতে চাই। কারণ আমরা জানি মুক্তিযুদ্ধের সময় আসলে এই জিনিসটা আসলে প্রপারলি হয় নাই। এই জন্য আসলে আমাদের এর পরের বাংলাদেশে আসলে নানা ধরনের বৈষম্য, নানা ধরনের দলাদলি, নানা ধরনের তৈরি হয়েছে আসলে। সো ইয়া, থ্যাংক ইউ। আপু একটু যদি ট্রান্সলেট করে দেন।
So what he was trying to say is about like the diversity of narratives and what happens and what had happened right after the liberation war in Bangladesh is that it became very like one way of looking at it. It became very one-dimensional. So he talked about history writing and how that always there's this tendency to exclude groups of people and exclude the diverse opinions, diverse ideologies that does spur a whole revolution, because a revolution is always not about like one single thing that is the end all and be all. And so for him, a more democratic, and in that sense a very democratic Bangladesh would look like a country that would acknowledge those diversities, those diverse opinions, those diverse ways of thinking, even if it's like a difference of opinion, to kind of allow for that on a very, even if it's on a very basic level, to allow for those diversities to kind of stay and coexist, is where he sees the next Bangladesh to be in, and also the next kind of democratic practices to be in Bangladesh.
Thank you, Amar and Farzana. And on that hopeful and aspirational note, I just want to thank you all again for being here. I know we're past our time limit here, but thanks so much for all your work and patience and all these inspiring, wonderful thoughts. Thank you.